Hey everyone, thanks so much for checking out this content on the Hillview YouTube channel. My name's Martin.
My name is Scott.
We're two of the pastors at the church, and it's our joy to welcome you to this time. We would love it if you're able to come and join us in person. If you'd like to do that, there's some contact details at the end of the video for how you can get in touch, and we'd love to connect you up in that way.
But we also understand that maybe you don't feel that you're able to join us in person yet, and so we do hope that this video is a blessing to you, that you find out a bit of what's happening in the church and you're able to study God's Word with us. We also understand that some people have been joining us from further afield, and we would love it if you could be part of a local fellowship, a local church, and we would love to help you with that as well. And so if we can, please get in touch with us. But it's great to have you here with us.
Yeah, so we're just praying that you will be blessed and helped by this content, and that Jesus will be glorified through this video. So take care. God bless.
Here are a few things coming up at Hillview for you and our church family. The next Ladies' Prayer and Share is tomorrow at 8 p.m. on Zoom. Please contact Janet Wendis for more information and the Zoom links. Save the dates for our summer holiday Bible club, The Wonder Zone, running from Monday the 12th to Friday the 16th of August. For more information and to sign up, please visit hillview.cc/HBC 2024. During the service, we will uplift our offering. If you are new with us, please don't feel under any obligation to give. We are so glad that you are here. If you did come prepared to give, there are several ways to do so. You can put your gift directly in the bowl as it comes down your row, give via bank transfer, or give online at hillview.cc/give. It has been fantastic to see so many new faces at Hillview over the past few months. We would love to invite you to a New to Hillview lunch on Sunday the 28th of April after the morning service. This is a great opportunity to meet fellow church members, learn more about who we are, and how you could join in with what God is doing among us. To help us with food planning, please sign up at hillview.cc/new to Hillview. We look forward to seeing you there. Recently, Hannah, Rachel and Faz spoke about the need for additional volunteers in Kids Church and a desire to assemble a team for the creche. These ministries provide an excellent opportunity to share the love of Jesus with the youngest members of our church. Practically speaking, Kids Church requires at least 6 volunteers over the age of 16 each week to run. We have a dedicated team at present, but to ensure that each volunteer only needs to participate once every 4 weeks, the team needs at least 24 people, which is currently not the case. We really need people to step up to this important ministry. If you can help in either of these important areas, please speak with Hannah, Faz, or someone at the Connect desk who will point you in the right direction. Join us for a blether and a fly cup on the first and third Wednesday of the month from 9 a.m. until 12 p.m. Relax, chat, read, or bring some activities with you. Stay for as long or as short as you like. This is open for everyone in the church and the local community. We're looking for more helpers to join the team. If you're interested, please contact John or Sheena Bevan. We can't wait to see you at Fly Cup.
I think Ruth will still be talking to me when we get back home after assigning that reading to her. Thank you, Ruth. It would be good to have a Bible open. If you don't have one, there'll be one at the back that you can go and pick up, or have it open on your phone. It's always good to check that what I say comes out of the Bible. I'm sure many of us here have made a major house move. We've done it several times. I know there's some people in the church that have done international house moves. The one that particularly comes to my mind was 25 years ago this year, actually, when we moved to Scotland from Bristol, moved up to Glasgow. Ruth and I had been married for 4 years. We had a 1-year-old Rachel, and Timothy was on the way. We did all the big life transitions all at the same time. I'd left the security of work to become a student again. and we sold our house down in Bristol, but we'd not yet got a house to move to up in Scotland. So Ruth and the children had to pack to go off to her parents in Oxfordshire, whereas I had to be up in Glasgow already. So I headed off by myself with my things I needed. She went with the things she needed. Some things went in the removals van. And I have a clear memory of driving up the M5 and then the M6 and then the M74 to Glasgow in our little car, as I had then, with the back of the car filled with the important things that we didn't want to give to the removers. And principal among that was trying to see the road through the rear view mirror, because I had all of Ruth's pot plants with me. Some from floor to ceiling, some on the back seat, some on the parcel shelf. And you certainly, it was a struggle to see. And I still remember that. We'd planned for the move, but when the day came, it still had that mix of excitement and anxiety. What was ahead for us, moving from one end of the country to the other, changing so many of the things in our lives? Well, surely those emotions that we felt on that day when we moved up to Scotland 25 years ago would have been similar emotions that many of God's people, Israel, would have felt at this point in time we've got to in the story of Numbers. The previous chapters in Numbers that we've looked at over the earlier part of this year, they've been all about getting God's people ready for the big move, getting them ready for this march to the promised land. And this chapter, chapter 10, is where that journey really begins. Now, it's a big transition, therefore, in the book of Numbers. And I know some people may not have been with us all the time that we've been looking in Numbers. So I thought it was a good time for a recap of the story so far. I don't know how well you can see that map. You may have to strain your eyes a little bit, but at least it gives us a feeling for the geography of the journey so far and the journey to come. It's only 57 weeks, in fact, just over a year, since the mighty Exodus from Egypt, which is recorded in Exodus chapter 12. The children of Israel, the people, they left Egypt carrying the bones of Joseph, the patriarch, with them. That meant they were leaving the slavery of Egypt for good. They were taking their patriarch with them because he had made them promise that he would be buried in the promised land. The first place they camped was Succoth, which is here. So they've moved from here to here, Succoth. And then after that, they crossed what's called the Red Sea, Exodus 13 and 14. It's likely the Sea of Reeds, which is near the area of the lakes that have now been incorporated into the Suez Canal. If you remember a year or two ago, a great big freight vessel got stuck in the canal. Well, just near there, some of the canal links up some lakes, and it's probably one of those lakes, which is area where they crossed. They then came to a place called Marah, which means bitter water, which generated problems for themselves. And then on to Elim, a place with 12 springs of fresh water and 70 palm trees. That's in Exodus 15. Then they went on down, so here's there down to Elim, and then into the desert of Sin, and eventually down to what is thought to be Sinai, which is where they are now, here. So in the desert of Sin, that was where the Lord gave them manna and quails, Exodus 16. He gave them water out of a rock, Exodus 17, because it was a desert place. That was the place where Moses met this man called Jethro, who was his father-in-law. He was married to a Midianite girl, the daughter of Jethro. And Jethro was a nomadic farmer. And he came from Midian. Midian is over, I've pressed the wrong button. Midian is over on here, the sort of northern bit of Saudi Arabia into Jordan area. So all desert sort of areas and nomadic farmers from Midian. And Jethro advised him wisely that he had to learn to delegate if he wasn't going to go under leading this large group of people. So a wise man. Then in Exodus 19, they finally arrived down at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula there in Sinai. It was 3 months after they had left Egypt. They camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, and they'd been there ever since. During their 10-month stay at Sinai, God had given them so much. He'd given them the 10 Commandments and the rest of the law, saying how he expected them to live. That's Exodus 20 to 23, the whole of the book of Leviticus, and Numbers 5 and 6. He'd reconfirmed the covenant with them to be their God and for them to be his people, Exodus 24. He'd promised his presence, his guidance, his blessing, and he sought their loyalty, their obedience, their worship. He'd given them the instructions on how to make the tabernacle and all of its contents, which they then went and made exactly according to the pattern that God had given them. That's Exodus 25 through to Exodus 40. He'd set apart and commissioned the priests and the Levites to manage the tabernacle. That was in Numbers 3 and 4. God had set up the whole sacrificial system of worship at the tabernacle. That's the book of Leviticus. So that there was a way made for his sinful people to live in the presence of the utterly holy God. So much God had done in those 10 months at Sinai. And he'd set up the camp. At the center of the camp was the tent of meeting, the tabernacle. Camped around that then were the Levites and the priests, the people he'd set apart to minister there. And then the 12 tribes, 3 to the east, 3 to the south, 3 to the west, and 3 to the north. And as Martin said so clearly 3 weeks ago, when we looked at Numbers chapter 9, God's presence was always with them. There was a pillar of fire by night and a cloud by day. And their obedience at this time really stood out. It said again and again, as Martin told us, they did just as the Lord had commanded. And finally, at the beginning of chapter 10, the Lord provided them with a public address system, the silver trumpets. That facilitated rapid communication across this big camp of so many people. Silver trumpets, a bit like the one on the screen now. This one actually came out of the tomb of Tutankhamun. But that was around the same kind of time as the Exodus. Not exactly, but same kind of era. So this is probably very similar to the trumpets. It's a silver trumpet from the tomb, and the wooden thing is a mute that goes inside the trumpet. And by moving the mute around, you can make different tones and different sounds and different rhythms with the trumpet. You get different patterns which they were instructed on how to use to alert people to get ready to break camp and move on, to prepare to fight against an enemy who was coming upon them, and to alert them when it was times for worship and sacrifice at the tabernacle. The silver trumpets became an audible, continual reminder of God's presence, his authority, and his help. Nowadays, we have exactly the same thing functionally with air raid sirens, like the ones that were going off we heard last night on the news in Jerusalem. Air raid sirens. Church bells. They're to tell everyone at once it's time for worship. Or even school bells, just to tell a whole school that's the end of the lesson and time to move on. We use something functionally very similar. In their day, silver trumpets. So, as we come to Numbers 10, verse 11 onwards, we're at a transition. Everything has been set up. Everything is ready. The journey in all earnest is about to begin. And if all goes well, it's only a few weeks and they're in the promised land. So, verses 11 to 13, which I call moving on. So after 11 months and 19 days camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, the cloud of God's presence finally moves. It lifts. God has decided it's time for them to go forwards, to move on as God's people. It says it was the second month. Well, that means it was April, May time, this sort of time of year. The trumpet sounded. Time to go towards the promised land. Imagine that buzz of excitement around the community. At last, after all those months at Sinai, setting up, working hard, we were off. And also that anticipation and fear of moving on, just like we experienced 25 years ago when we pulled everything apart, broke camp, and moved to Scotland. In the previous 59 chapters of the Bible, nothing had been left to chance by God. He'd given clear instructions. Everyone knew their God-assigned role as they moved on into the land. There were to be no petty squabbles amongst them on who should do what. No arguments about who should be at the front and who should be at the rear. No. They were ready to encounter whatever came. The tribe at the front, led by Judah, were there to deal with what challenges emerged along the road. Those at the back, with the tribe of Dan, they were ready to repel any bandits that might be coming up behind them as the column moved off. If they obeyed God through the instructions he gave to his servant Moses, their future would surely be glorious. So then there's the procession. Those are in those verses 14 through to 28. The people of God just move out when the trumpet sounds in harmonious accord. They've been preparing. What does the marching order look like? Well, there's 7 groups. At the front are the Kohathites, some of a family of the Levites, and they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant, God's presence with them. Then 3 tribes from Judah, Issachar, Zebulun. Then you've got more of the Levites, the Gershonites and Merarites. They're carrying the tabernacle, the poles, the tents, the actual building of the tabernacle. Then 3 more tribes, Reuben, Simeon, Gad. And then the rest of the Kohathites carrying all the furnishings that go inside the tabernacle. The tabernacle itself went first. That gave a chance for them to put it up so that when the furniture arrived, it could just be slotted straight and safely in. And then Benjamin, Manasseh, and Ephraim, and bringing up the rear, Naphtali, Asher, and Dan. A clear order of march. The verses all list Israel by divisions and say each lifting their standard. A bit like, when they have the processions at the beginning of the Olympics or the Commonwealth Games and the teams from all the different countries. They have a banner they raise saying, we're the team from Great Britain, we're the team from France, and so on. There'll be a standard that each of them had, and they followed behind that standard. That reminds us that Israel, set up by divisions and with standards, that the people are heading for war in the promised land. You see, the land that they've been promised is not sitting there empty. It has other people already in it. Now, we may not like this war imagery very much, especially at the current time. But for us, what we should take from this is we must remember that as the Church of Jesus Christ, we are engaged in spiritual warfare. It's not material warfare to take land, but it's spiritual warfare to build a kingdom. Paul, the Apostle Paul, instructs every Christian that we should be dressed as a soldier. Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 and 13, Paul says, "Put on the full armor of God so you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground." We must be prepared. That helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the sword of the Spirit, the only offensive weapon in it, the sandals fitted with the readiness to share the gospel of peace, and so on. We are on a war footing, a spiritual battle against the devil and all the authorities that are in this world. It's easy for us to forget that, but we mustn't. So moving on, the procession. And now we come to verses 29 to 32, and I'm going to focus especially on these verses. Inviting Hobab. Moses had the guiding cloud. Moses was hearing the voice of God telling him what to do, but he knew he still needed human companions like Hobab to help him on the journey. Moses was a spiritual giant of a man, but he had the humility to know he needed support. We can all learn from that too. Moses says to Hobab, verse 31, "You can be our eyes." You see, Hobab had grown up in the desert as his home. He knew the environment. He understood the weather patterns. He had practical survival skills. When the cloud stopped moving and the Israelites prepared to camp, he would know exactly where it was best to put the tents so that they were protected from desert storms. He was the sort of Bear Grylls of this time. As people of God today, we need the wisdom, the skills, and the feedback of one another to make sure we move on in the right way. And even as we know God is leading and guiding us, and as we know that our hearts are fixed on Him, our hearts are fixed on serving Him, fixed on doing His work, we still need the input and expertise of other people. We cannot and must not do it as individuals. Ruth and I are acutely aware how much we need and appreciate the help of others as we lead and run the Crusoe Trust. We have trustees, we have volunteers who enable the mission to make better choices and equip us to do things for the kingdom that the two of us alone could not do. We could use more volunteers, more help, just like the church could do with more volunteers, more help, like for the Sunday school. Each of us can be the Lord's gift to someone else in our church community, in their Christian journey. We need each other. We need to step up for each other. Hobab was the brother-in-law of Moses. He was the son of Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, who I mentioned in the summary earlier. Jethro was probably dead by now, and Hobab was now the chief of the family, from the way it's written. Hobab was a Kenite, which is a sub-tribe of the Midianites. That's the people who are living east of Sinai. They're not part of God's special people. But Moses wanted to bring Hobab on the journey with him. However, initially, when the cloud moved on, Hobab wanted to go back home to his own people. Maybe they were about to enter territory that Hobab was less familiar with. Maybe after this time with them, he was beginning to lose his nerve. We don't know. But Moses was really determined to persuade Hobab to stay. Hobab did not belong. Indeed, he could not belong to God's people unless he became a part of God's people. So I think there's three key things I want us to see in this encounter between Moses and Hobab. First of all, Moses believed the promises of God, beginning of verse 29. Now Moses said to Hobab, son of Reuel, son of Jethro, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are setting out for the place about which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Moses was totally confident that God would deliver what he had promised. Moses knew where he was going. Moses was therefore a pilgrim on a journey to a destination. In contrast, Hobab was a nomad. He had no future horizon beyond the wilderness that he had grown up in. And you know, that's what so many people in our society today are. They're nomads. They are people wandering about aimlessly in the world. They have birth. They get education. They get employment. Maybe they get marriage, family, retirement. And then what? Nothing. They're born in the wilderness. They live in the wilderness. They die in the wilderness. Jesus said in Mark 8:36, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet forfeit his soul? The whole world is born into nomadic life. It doesn't matter how much you earn or how much you own, or how little you earn, or how little you own. Anyone without a future in Jesus Christ is just a nomad in this world. They just go round and round with no ultimate future. I wonder, what will people say at your funeral? Will people talk about your career, your hobbies, your family? Is that it? Or will they have something lasting, legacy to say about you? In contrast to Hobab, Moses was a pilgrim on a journey with a clear purpose and a defined destination. He knew that all he had now was not all there was to have. He knew that he was heading for the promised land. And likewise, the Christian believer has a purpose and a destination, a sure and certain hope of glory in heaven and eternal life. Indeed, the writer to the Hebrews indicates that Moses and many of the other heroes of the Old Testament knew that God had something planned for them that was even better than the earthly promised land. And he has that for us. Christians, therefore, have confidence in their hearts and on their lips, and they can be assertive about their futures because they know where they are going. They are pilgrims. They are not nomads. Paul wrote to Timothy from the squalor, remember, of a prison cell when he was in prison for his faith. He said, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced that he is able to guard until that day what has been entrusted to me. Are you ashamed? Do you know what you've believed? Does that put you on a clear pilgrim pathway to a destination? Faith is being sure of what we hope for, certain of what we cannot see. Remember, in the end, Moses never entered the earthly promised land. He saw it from afar, from the top of Mount Nebo on the east side of the River Jordan. But you know, when he climbed Mount Nebo, he walked into a far more glorious future than the earthly promised land. Do you believe the promises of God? Are you sure of your future? Moses believed, but second, Moses enjoyed the promises of God. Also, verse 29, second half, he said to Hobab, come with us, and we will treat you well. For the Lord has promised good things to Israel. These are the words of Moses to Hobab. Do you think he said them with a sad face or a happy face? Come with us. We'll treat you well because the Lord's promised good things to Israel. Do you think he said it like that? No, he was an enthusiast. He was radiant with expectation and certainty. And yet, remember, he was still living in the desert. His passion was so much greater than you would expect from the circumstances, the earthly circumstances he found himself in. And that should be us as well. Thinking back to my younger days when I climbed a lot of mountains, I remember somebody once said to me after we'd done 4 Munro Mountains in terrible weather, she said, you're the only person I know who can get me out of bed and up 4 Munros in the rain and mist, and at the end of it, I feel I've had a really good day, and I haven't seen a thing. She said, it's just your enthusiasm to get up this hill and get climbing and get walking. And it wasn't Ruth that said that. Passion takes us a long way in the midst of difficult circumstances. Enthusiasm, that comes by believing, and it comes by enjoying what we believe. As Christians, we should enjoy the hope of heaven now, in this life. Because, only a tiny fraction of our life is going to be lived here. The vast majority of it will be elsewhere, and it will be so much better. Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, and verse 17, for this light momentary affliction, talking about this life that he was in, this light momentary affliction is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory. Beautiful term. Weight of glory beyond all comparison. Like Moses, we should enjoy the pilgrim experience of knowing God. We should live now with anticipation of the full weight of glory that is to come. That should affect our lives today. And we should be offering that shared enjoyment to the spiritual nomads that are around us. And let's not do it with a grim, stern face, burdened by the weight of our current circumstances or the state of the world around us. We're on a journey to somewhere better. Moses believed, Moses enjoyed, and then Moses offered the promises of God. He, that's Hobab, answered, "No, I will not go with you. I'm going back to my own land and my own people," for whatever reason it was. But Moses said, "Please do not leave us. You know where we should camp in the wilderness, and you can be our eyes. If you come with us, we will share with you whatever good things the Lord gives us." Moses must have communicated his passion to Hobab. You could say in many ways he was a persistent evangelist by the way he did it. At first, Hobab wanted nothing to do with it. "No, thank you. Not interested." How often do we hear that from friends and neighbours and even family? But yes, after initially declining to join them on the journey, he was convinced to change his mind. Moses wanted Hobab with them for his skills, his desert skills, but he also wanted him for himself, for Hobab himself. He wanted Hobab to be amongst God's people and to be with God himself. Although it's not stated explicitly, it's implied that Moses got his man. Verse 33 says, "So they headed out from the mountain of the Lord." That could be the whole community, or it could be Moses and Hobab. But the better evidence is 200 years later, 200 years later, the book of Judges. Judges 1:16, we read, "And the descendants of the Kenite," Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, "went up with the people of Judah from the city of palms into the wilderness of Judah and settled with the people." So Hobab's family are still there 100, 200 years later as part of God's people. They've been integrated in. They were outsiders, but they joined God's people. Happens then and it happens now. People who are nomads join on the pilgrim journey. And notice verse 32. It says, "If you come with us, we will treat you well, and God will give you the good things that he is giving us." The benefits, the blessings will be the same for the outsider as for the insider if the outsider joins God's people. Treat people well. Draw them in. Be inclusive. And God will make you a channel of his blessing into the lives of others. But to do that, God's people must have very high standards. We must have the highest standards, the best of motives, the purest of morality, the most genuine friendship, the warmest love. And we must preach and teach that certain hope and a secure future are found only in Christ. Otherwise, why will people not just stick with their nomadic life? Because they think that's all there is. So let's be as happy a nomad as I can be for the days I've got. Christians and their churches should be the most attractive place for people to come into. Think about this. The Bible says we are to be the bride of Christ. We are the bride of Christ. Did you ever see an unattractive bride on her wedding day? Moses was offering Hobab the opportunity of salvation, just as we are called to offer that opportunity to people today through Christ. If you come with us, you will share in the good things that God will be giving to us. Say that, and it will bring glory to Christ. So that's the encounter with Hobab. And then finally, briefly, the ark and the cloud in verses 33 to 36. So God's people, they leave Sinai in verse 33. The mountain of the Lord, initially for a 3-day first leg to the first destination that's mentioned then in chapter 11. The term mountain of the Lord, it frames that sense of departure with a reminder that as they venture into the unknown, even the mountains, even the deserts, all these places, they are his. There is nowhere that is beyond the reach, the possession, the ownership of God. As they depart, the cloud of the Lord's presence rests on them, verse 34. The pillar of cloud, a miracle of nature given by God for them. It guides them. It provides shade from the burning sun as they travel by day. At the head of the procession was the Ark of the Covenant, the focal point of relationship between God and his people. That has to come first in all our life processions. It's the first time in the Bible these two words, the Ark and the Covenant, are used together. The Ark representing God's presence with his people, and the Covenant, the relationship that historically began back in Genesis 12 verse 3 between God and Abraham, the covenant that we are still part of today as God's people today. Psalm 105 beautifully describes God's provision all through the Exodus and the wilderness journey. Just picking out verses 42 and 43, it says, "For he, God, remembered his holy promise and Abraham, his servant. So he brought his people out with joy, his chosen ones with singing." They were happy, they were joyful, they were enthusiastic, they were obedient. It's as good as it can get. Within a few weeks, they'll be in the promised land. Come back next week and you'll hear how short-lived an obedient, God-centered group of God's people, how short-lived that can be. So what are our learnings for conclusion? What should we learn from the story? Number one, do not fear the future. Humanly speaking, Israelites had everything to fear in the wilderness. It was unknown. They were moving to a land they had never visited, and it contained an enemy they had never seen. We all know that uncertainty can be something that's very hard to live with. Many of us will be facing uncertainties at the time. You feel very powerless to deal with them, to do anything about it. It can be very hard to live with. But you know, there was one thing of which they could be totally certain, that the Lord would go with them through the desert, through the storms. He would march ahead of them by means of his ark, verse 33, and he would overshadow them with his protective cloud, verse 34. God was in their midst, just as he is in our midst today. He will be faithful to protect us, to guide us, to bless us. Our God is mighty to save. Moses prayed each day for God's promise to be fulfilled. Every morning for the Lord to defeat his and their enemies, verse 35. Each evening that the Lord would come back and dwell in their midst in the camp, verse 36. And for us, think of the words of Jesus, the most common words he ever spoke. Do not fear. As Jesus walked on water in the midst of the storm, the disciples were terrified. And he said, "Do not fear. It's I." You know, whatever life may bring, God delivers his promises. People may fail us. People will fail us. But God never does. As the psalmist says, "My flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." Whatever the future may hold, with him, we do not need to fear. And tied into that, secondly, is God is leading us, like them, to a place of rest. Verse 33, the ark of the covenant of the Lord went before them for 3 days' journey to seek out a resting place for them. The people needed to rest, to relax peacefully as they travelled. Not only each night of that initial 3-day journey, but for the rest of the journey and in the promised land especially, a permanent place of rest. A place where they could settle without fear. God provided us with Jesus to give us soul-satisfying rest. If you're struggling with anxiety, with fear, with sickness, with impending death, claim Christ's promise of peace and rest. It's there for you freely. Jesus said in Matthew 11, verses 28 and 29, "Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Peace, rest. "For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." That's especially a message to those who are struggling. This soul-satisfying rest, remember, is not just for us to keep for ourselves. For those of us who are already Christian pilgrims, that promise is there. But it's also for the nomads, the hobabs of our day. And if that's you here, you know you're a nomad. Join us on this journey with the Lord. Yes, even today. Go from being a nomad to a pilgrim. If you know others out there, help them to make that transition from nomad to pilgrim. And all of us then will find that same soul-satisfying rest in Jesus Christ, which already so many of us here enjoy.